Yeah, okay, perfect. So I won't be seeing you guys, but if you want to interrupt me or stop me while we're talking, I'm happy to do that, or you can save your questions till the end. So I want to start off by acknowledging that I come from the University of Manitoba campuses that are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, and we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. And we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So I'd like to start a little bit by talking about what is excellence. And I don't know if people are familiar with this triangle, but like there's different levels of excellence, I would say. Like you have expert opinions, which is great, and they can be excellent. But in order to have high impact in your research and in your publications, you probably want to aim higher than writing expert opinions. So we'll get back to some of this later on, but I think there are different levels of research and research excellence. And I think especially when you start out, you have to always aim higher and do better research so that you can have a better impact. So I'm just going to start off with grant writing tips. And as I explained, these are things that I have kind of collected over the last 11 years. I had a little bit of grant writing experience coming from the Netherlands, working with my supervisor there. But nothing major. And I must say, especially in working with John McGavick, that took me to another level of grant writing. And so a lot of the tips and points that I'm going to highlight come from me interacting with him and talking back and forth and working together on one of my earlier grants. So I think, and I was really bad at this when I started out. I always like to kind of write it like with a lot of pressure the last 2 weeks before the deadline. But I think I've learned that it's really important to start early and allow for enough time to fine tune and make it better and better. And my first CHR grant, when I got it, I think I spent almost a month before the deadline just to make the figures look better and make everything line up. And it had nothing to do with actual grant writing or science or research. It just had everything to do with how it looked like. And I questioned myself, well, is this the way we should do this? And is it worth it? But it paid off for me getting the grant. So I think there is definitely an argument to start as early as you can and spend enough time on it. The other thing that really helped me in the beginning was to get a good, successful grant as an example. And I asked Norm Rosenblum, who was at that point the director of CCH CSP, if he had a successful grant that I could use. I'm doing lung basic science, so I wasn't in his field of kidney development, but I had been at one of the grant writing workshops that he had given at that point, and I thought he was a really good grant writer and he'd been successful. So I asked him for a successful grant, and when I started to write my own first bigger project grant for CHR, I put his grant up on one side of the screen and my grant next to it, and I tried to kind of get the feeling of the grant that he had into my own grant. And I felt when I read his grant, I was not familiar really with his work, but to me it almost read like a newspaper article. So it was easy to follow, it was easy to understand for me, and ever since I've been trying to get that across in my grants. I think it's important to tell a good story. You have to be able to kind of compel your audience and your reviewers. I think that's for anything we do in science. there's different ways of, it's fairly simple, especially I think as a basic scientist, to impress people with jargon and with complex formulas or complex pictures, complex molecular biology techniques. But I'm not sure if that is as effective as trying to explain it at a level where people actually understand what you're doing, even if they're not from that field. And you might have people reviewing your grant that are not completely familiar with your field. So you have to take that into account. I think it's important to be able to summarize your framework, your program that you're proposing in one page, and I'll come back to that later. As I alluded to, you have to make your grant look nice. Like the last thing you want is to upset the reviewer. And I don't know if you've been reviewing for panels and have your own experience in grant reviews. I would recommend that at some point to definitely participate in that, because I've learned a lot from that as well. But the last thing you want is to upset the reviewers with reading a grant, and they get upset because there's grammar mistakes, spelling mistakes, the figures are grainy, and it just distracts from the message you want to get across. So you have to allow enough time to make your grant look nice. And then I think one other thing that is really important is that you want to try and find the most critical person in your network to review your grant and be brutally honest. And then when they do that, don't take it personally. So start early. Look at the call for applications. Really pay attention to what they're asking for. What type of information is the funding agency looking for? And I got my first CHR grant when it was the first round of online review. They actually moved away from it afterwards. But I think part of the success was that I paid really careful attention to the instructions and to the guidelines for reviewers to look for in the application and look for the information. And I took some of that information literally and put it literally in the grant, so that if they had to tick a box in their review form and say, well, is this application addressing this item, that it was easy for them to find it, and it was easy for them to evaluate my grant for that. You can familiarize yourself with grants that have been previously funded. So look at kind of the information they're looking for, look at what has been successful, get a feel for if you know people on the panel, on the committee, see what they can give you for inside information. So get to know your potential reviewers and write the grant with that audience in mind. So think about things that they might come up with while they're reviewing your grant. And then also, as I said, read the instructions for the reviewers. So try and find, and especially CHR is pretty open about these things. So look at who's on the panel that you're submitting to. See if you know these people, see if you can ask some of these people for information. Some of them would have to declare conflict then because they can't be there during the discussion, but try and get a bit of insight in how the committee functions, what they're looking for, so that you are well prepared. So this is an example that on the left of the screen, it says the reviewer instructions, and it says, are the anticipated project contribution likely to advance health-related knowledge? So I copied that into my grant. So I literally said results from our studies will advance the knowledge. And so that's how I try to get it into the head of the reviewers that we're doing what is required for this grant to be funded. So this is taken from a workshop, this information by Dr. Jim Nagy. He's a physiology professor. So when they started these online project grants, he was really upset, and it was like a 5-page proposal, and he felt this is ridiculous, and we've had such a good system with in-person reviews and committees, and why are we moving away from this? So he was so upset with the whole system at CHR that he submitted 5 grants, and all 5 of them were funded that round. So that was pretty special, especially taking into account that the funding rate, success rate, was only 6%. So he's, I think, one of our best grant writers at the university, and he gives a workshop, and he's really, worked on a system that if you follow it, I think, and answer a lot of the questions that he mentioned in his workshop, that you'll be able to develop your grant proposal better. And I'm happy to share the slides afterwards with this group. So he said, if you ask the following questions before you start writing and answer them in your proposal, that is the information that is required for the reviewers to get a good feeling for background information and to set the stage for the proposal. So what is known? What is not known? What is the problem that we don't know right now? Why do we need to know? And what is the reason that we don't know so far? And what I've started to do, when I started out, I always, in the beginning, I was just starting at page 1 and started to write my proposal pretty much as a story. But I've actually changed that, and I've actually started to use these headings to fill in the blanks in between and paragraphs in between to start answering these questions, to have a better framework for my grants. So then what has changed now that will allow us to know when this grant gets funded? Where should the focus be for new knowledge? Who will take advantage? And why am I the right person to propose this research? And why would I be the right person, if I get the funding, to be successful? Then you have to have an overall hypothesis and strategy. Then the rationale explains why you're proposing the research. Your aim is the strategy of how you're gonna investigate that. And he recommends to pose the aim as a question. There's debate on that. I don't do that, but he has done that, and he's been successful with that. So that's like personal flavor, I would say. So I don't know if people are familiar with this writing course. I'm just gonna come back to the, oh, sorry. Just gonna stop sharing and go back to Zoom. Have people heard about this writing course from Stanford?
No,
I haven't.
No.
So I'll go back to sharing. It's an online writing course, and I think it's still free through Coursera. If you pay a little bit, you can get CME credits for it. And I thought it was really helpful. It really helped me in the beginning to get a better sense for scientific writing. And all my students now, when they start in my lab, I mandate that they take the course. And I actually tell them, I'm not going to be reviewing your manuscript or abstracts unless you show me that you've taken the course. It really is a good resource. So I'll go back to my presentation. Yeah, so I really highlight, I really think this is a great course for people to take. And some of these tips come from that course. So write to engage, not to bore. I don't know if people have, I didn't ask, but if they have been reviewing grants or been on panels, some people get like 8 or 10 grants to review. And if you see some of these CHR grants, they're easily like 50 to 100 pages long. So if you have to review 10 of these, and most people are pretty busy, you better write in a way that they're actually excited about reading it and spending the time on it. So you have to find a way to get the reader and the reviewer engaged and interested. You have to write in an active voice. Do not use any jargon, abbreviations, fake words, negatives. Learn how to cut. Keep it really simple. And Dr. Neji, the person I was talking about, like really short sentences. I find, I've been thinking about this a little bit and discussing it with people. I find going to high school and university, becoming a doctor and then doing research, it almost sounds like we're trained to come across really smart and scientific and fancy and complex. I think we don't have to write in a way that it comes across as dumb, but I think we lose ourselves sometimes in trying to sound too fancy and too scientific and too complex. And I think we have to take that into account when we're writing our grants. So in that course, they recommend that 70% of the time should be spent on pre-writing. You have to collect your ideas, you have to synthesize, you have to organize your ideas, look at the flow of the story, look at how you're guiding the reader and the reviewer through the grant. Brainstorm the take-home message, think about your theoretical framework, try and summarize it in one figure or an infographic, because that really makes you focus on what is important for your proposal. And they recommend to work out the ideas away from the computer. So instead of sitting behind your computer, work on a desk, work under a tree outside in another area, so that you are kind of a bit away from the computer work. I think I'll get back to some other stuff later. So then 10% is your first draft. And they really stress to just get your work on paper. Just start writing. Don't worry about how it reads yet. Don't be too perfectionistic, and mainly focus on a logical flow. And I worked with a PhD student at some point. He was a colleague while I was doing my PhD, and he could spend the entire day to perfection his sentences, only to get it back like 3 days later from a supervisor, completely revised. So there's time afterwards for that. So just get all your thoughts on paper and mainly focus on flow at this point. And then 20% revisions. The course recommends to read it out loud. I don't like to do that. It doesn't work for me, but a lot of people benefit from that. Word has a function where you can have Word read out the sentences that you've written, so that would work. Get rid of the clutter. So all the fancy words, all the special long sentences, try and simplify it and cut out what you don't need. And then, so tell a good story. So this is Dr. Bernard Thibault. He's from Ottawa, neonatologist, and in the beginning I also worked with him a little bit. He's also in lung development research, and he reviewed one of my early grants, and he recommended this book, and I would highly recommend it to you. It talks about how to tell a good story to make it stick, and I'll show you some examples. So it's a good recommendation. So I always started my grants by using the textbook statement that CDH occurs 1 in every 3,000 newborns. So that's true, that's the epidemiology, and that's what we learn in medical school. But I since learned to change that to every 10 minutes a baby with CDH is born, which is also true, but it gives a different sound to it. More than 50,000 babies are born with CDH each year, which is also true. And then what is really resonated with some of the people that were reviewing my grants is that CDH is almost as common as cystic fibrosis or spina bifida. Everybody has heard of cystic fibrosis. Almost nobody has heard of congenital diabetic hernia. So as soon as you bring in these kind of comparisons and try and bring ideas out that people know from other situations to compare to, it gives them a new kind of framework that helps to set up the reviewer for a different mindset. So that was a real eye-opener for me. Same for the mortality rate. So the mortality rate of congenital diaphragmatic hernia can be, or it's a survival rate here, but can be as high as 20% mortality, 80% survival. So in doing some calculation and reflecting on that, I've changed that to every year of the 100 children that are born with CDH in Canada, 20 to 30 will die of complications. It's the same information, but just stated in a different way. And then also very compelling, I think, is since the year 2000, more than 400,000 CDH babies have died worldwide from this disease. That sounds a lot more urgent and important than saying that 20% of the babies with CDH die. That just doesn't mean anything to people, even people in the field and people in the medical field. So reflect on your own research, what you're doing, and how you can leverage information that people are familiar with to get your story across. Make it easy for the reviewer. And I think there's a real art to this in grant writing. And I think this is really where you need a good mentor or reviewer to work with you to point this out to me. I think most of the time people write in a way and leave it up to the reader to come to the conclusion that they draw, that you want them to draw. So you write something and you say, you stop there, you stop after you complete your paragraph, and then you assume in your mind that the reviewer is going to think the same thing that you are thinking they were going to think. That can be true, but it can also really not be true. And especially if they read really fast, you want to feed it to the reviewers in a way that you control the messaging. So I have learned to use that as a structure where every paragraph I end with a bit of a conclusion or a lead up to what I'm going to present in the next piece of the text. So instead of me hoping that the reviewer will think, well, maybe they are going to propose this and this to study, I'm actually spelling that out for them now and saying, based on this preliminary data, we're proposing here to study this, this, and this as outlined in the below area on proposed experiments. So that is something that really made a difference, I think, in my grants. And I think that's where structure and working with headings and working with paragraphs with headings will make a huge difference. So this is another piece on this slide that I think is important, more important than people think. So at Keijzer, I think they request, at least when I was writing these grants, they request challenges and mitigation strategies. So I started using that exact wording. So because if you get a reviewer that is instructed to look for information on challenges and mitigation strategies, if you use pitfalls and resolutions, which other people have used, they might be confused and not find what you actually want them to find in your grant application. And you might get feedback on your proposal saying that you did not provide any information on challenges and mitigation strategies. So make it easy for the reviewer to review your grant and come up with a summary for the review that they would have to provide to the committee when your grant is discussed, and when they have to write their report. Any questions so far? I can't see your screen, so if I don't hear anything, I assume
no questions from my end. Yeah,
no question.
I just had one question. You had mentioned, earlier that know your reviewers. When would CIHR tell you that who is reviewing your grant? I think it's all a secret, right? Until later on when they tell you who's in the committee. So we would never come to know who is sitting, who is the committee, who is the scientific officer, who is the chair, right?
No, but you know from the last time, right? So you will be able to find the information from the last competition. And I mean, I would say 60 to 80% of the same people will be on the committee reviewing your grant.
All right, thank you. Okay.
It's not always exactly the same, but they're definitely going to be people that are continuing on that same committee.
Yeah, and I want to highlight your point that you mentioned about sitting on these grant panels. I was fortunate this year to sit on the CIHR committee for the reviewer in training program that CIHR started. I think that was an eye opener. That was a complete eye opener. And if people here have not applied for that program, I would highly recommend you applying for it.
I would agree. I think I learned most from hearing the discussions of what people. You'll get to see good grants for one thing, right? You'll get to see what gets funded, but you also get familiar with how a grant can go from like high scores to being completely tanked just based on a little thing that gets picked up by one reviewer and completely changes the discussion.
And it happens so many times.
So, it depends a bit on the panel, but I think you have to become familiar with that process and also learn how to navigate that a little bit in your grant writing and how you would answer to the reviewers and those kind of things. Yeah, highly recommended. I would agree.
Totally agree. Yes.
Okay, we'll continue. Okay, so make it easy for the reviewer. So they have to write summaries, right, when they write their reports. So I use bolding and italics to highlight parts of the text that I find that are important for them to use in their summary or to follow the review and the grant. So my hypothesis, I always make that bold so that people, if they need to state the hypothesis again to the committee, that it's easy for them to find and they don't have to scramble to look for where was it that I read this. And so you don't want to bury these things. You want to make it really clear to them. This is really important too. And I did that the opposite, I think. Each paragraph, you have to start with your most important statement. So that's your one sentence that is either answering that important question that I showed in the beginning, or is the important thing that you want to get across to the reader. And the same holds true for manuscript writing, I think. A lot of this is applicable to that as well. But I think the first sentence needs to be your most important statement. So it needs to be a reverse triangle structure. Then behind that first important statement, you're going to back up that statement with evidence and your arguments. And then, as I said, I think really, really good writing is if you can end each paragraph with a summarizing statement linking back to your proposal. So in that way, you spoon feed the information to the reviewer. And if they scan your application, and that's another thing that happens during these panels, some people were not like the first primary, secondary, or tertiary reviewer on your grant, but they might still participate in the discussion. So they might be scanning your proposal while the proposal is discussed. If they can easily scan through and pick up on the first and last sentence of each paragraph and pick up the important parts, that will help them form their ideas in their head. Whereas if you bury your most important statement in the middle of that paragraph, you're losing out. So this is an example of one of my own grants. Like the first sentence is putting a really important statement. Then in the middle, I kind of build it up and say, well, this is what we're proposing to do. And then I end the paragraph and I use italics to say, well, what we see here can be due to two things. And thus we propose the following studies. So now you're pulling the reviewer back in and saying, well, this is interesting. We need to follow up, and here it comes. As opposed to leaving it up to the reader to think, well, what are they going to do? This is what I mean by ending each paragraph with a connecting sentence. And I think I'm not familiar with your grants and how you've been writing, but for me, when I started to do that, that made a huge difference. So don't bury the lead. So first statement, really important. Then you support it, and then you come to a conclusion or a connecting sentence for the next piece of information that you want to feed them. So this was on the left, like how I started out. And then I changed it to these kind of statements, where it's a lot more precise, a lot more to the point, and a lot more easy to read and follow. Anchor the reader. So I always started by saying abnormal lung development results in pulmonary hypoplasia and persistent pulmonary hypertension. That's true. That's what you read in the textbook. But that's not necessarily what's going to pull the reviewer away from like watching a hockey game while they're reviewing your grant, or getting excited about what they're reading. So I've changed that for children with CDH and their parents. The inevitable pulmonary hyperplasia and persistent pulmonary hypertension is a lifelong source of stress and morbidity. So then you make it a lot more like palpable to the reader how important this research is going to be. Keep the story rolling. Like these are just some sentences and examples that I've used. So I mentioned that I when I work with somebody and try and mentor them for their grant writing, I always ask them to come up with a one-page infographic. And if you look at the major scientific journals, they've started to do that too for their major papers, where they ask for one infographic summarizing your research. And I think what helps with that for yourself, if you force yourself to do that, is to get really clear focus on what you're trying to study and how you're going to be studying that. I have started to invest in graphics and use good graphics to make it look nice. Like the funding rate at CHR is about 15%. If you think about it, it doesn't mean that the other 85% that doesn't get funded is proposing bad research or doing bad work. It just means that there is not enough money to fund more people. So you have to stand out. You have to make it look nice. You have to compel the reader. And a lot of it is very visual these days. Instagram and everybody is looking at pictures and short movies more than text. So you want to invest in this a little bit. The other thing I've learned from that is if you work with, you can do this yourself, or you can work with a student who's interested in this. But when I started, I actually hired a graphic design person for a small amount of money. It was a few $100s. And he is a high school teacher, a science high school teacher. And he does this on the side, and he really enjoys doing that. And I asked him to come up with an improved figure. And what became clear, and when I tried to explain my research to him, is that it wasn't super clear to him yet. So in going back and forth, I was able to better clarify my research question and my own framework. So I really think it's important to spend some time on this. And this is where the lead up of 4 to 6 months comes in really handy, I think. program I've used is mindthegraph.com. They have a lot of good pictures. I think a paid subscription is $100. They have a free version as well. The other really good program for basic science is BioRender. A lot of my students are using that. And it's amazing how professional looking pictures you can make by using those websites. So this is an example from Mind the Graph, and you can just download these if you pay for that. And there's lots of good examples there and pictures that we've started using in my lab. So this is what I started out with, which is okay. I mean, it summarizes what we did, but it doesn't look very professional or fancy. And I'm not saying that it all has to look fancy, but you have to keep in mind that if the reviewers and the panels can choose between, and have to choose between applications, if it looks better, you have a higher chance of getting funded. So this is what we changed it to, and it just looks a bit more professional and appealing. And I don't think it's still perfect. There's other things that can be improved, but at least you can see the progression. This is another example. This is from Kelly Thiessen. She was a career development awardee from CCH-CSP in the last few years. She's from the University of Manitoba as well. And I worked with her in preparing her grant for CCH-CSP. And when I wasn't the selection chair yet or on the selection committee, and I asked her to summarize her framework in one page. And this is what she came up with. And it summarizes her work, but I don't know if people are familiar with WordPerfect, but that's when I started grad studies. We were using WordPerfect for our documents. So it looks a bit technical and not very appealing. And so I asked her to invest a little bit of money and work with this graphical designer and change it into something more appealing. And this is what they came up with. And that is the exact same information as what she had in this slide, but you hopefully agree with me that this is a lot more appealing and a lot more easy to digest. So that's just another example. So make it look nice. I've said that. Please don't have any spelling mistakes. Like Word is really good at picking up on spelling mistakes. I use Grammarly.com, as I say, like Lara. English is not my first language, so I had to learn this along the way. And Grammarly is a really good online website, again, both free and subscription if you want to use a little bit fancier application from them. And you can run your text through their program, and it will give you feedback on the style of writing. It will give you feedback on grammar mistakes. It would give you feedback if you're using too much passive writing instead of active writing, and also suggest changes to improve your writing. So I always run my grants through Grammarly before I submit them. Because even if I have it reviewed by people, some people just don't pick up on things that this program picks up on. So that's a really good thing. Hemingway is a program that can suggest changes to your text for the lay summary. It is a program that gives you feedback on your style of writing. And I think they say for your lay summary, you should aim for grade 7 or 8 writing style. And it would actually give you feedback in what kind of style it is. And you can get suggestion to make it better, a better lay summary. And you would think, well, why is that important? Your lay summary will come online from CHR. It would be used for press releases sometimes. And locally here at our research institute, for the grants that we can apply to, the parent and patient stakeholders that are part of the reviewing committee only provide feedback on the lay summary and how understandable it was. And if it wasn't understandable enough, that would be taken into account for your grant review. So it might be more important than you think. Spend time on your figures and legends. Make it look nice. it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. You have to be careful that if you make it look so nice that it looks like you copy and pasted it out of the published paper, they might say, well, listen, this has been published. Why would we still fund this work? But it needs to be almost ready to get published. It shows you that you take the reviewer seriously and that you appreciate that they spend their time on reviewing your grant. The last thing you need is getting feedback on grantmanship and that it was difficult to read, that there was lots of jargon. As soon as the discussion starts around that, you can propose a work that will be submitted to Nature, Science, and Cell. But if it's a mess, it's going to be hard to get funded. So this is a figure that I used in the beginning of my grants when I submitted them. And slowly but surely, I changed that and evolved that into a figure like this, which is not taken from a publication, but it's getting pretty close. It looks more like what you would expect from a manuscript publication. And just paying attention to legends, paying attention that it's all nicely lined out and looking nice. Icing on the cake, and I think it's a must for basic science application, is preliminary data, which would show that you have the techniques in-house and the experience to actually be successful in what you're proposing. Again, you can't have so much preliminary data that they're going to say, well, you've already done the work, so we don't have to fund it. But I do think it is important to show feasibility with preliminary data. And it helps you to compel the reviewer that it's going to be worth investing in you. I did this myself, and I think it has helped me set the stage for some of my grant applications. Consider doing a systematic review on what is already known about the topic that you're studying and publish that, because it's a fairly nice opening of your grant application to say, we recently published in a systematic review that there is a knowledge gap in this area, and this is what we're going to be addressing in this grant proposal. So I think you get a good publication out of that, and it's also a really nice lead into your grant and a rationale for your grant. Follow the evaluation checklist. Make sure that you have everything checked off and allow enough time to fix things if it's not correct. Like in the spring this year, when I submitted my CHR grant, I got an emergency email saying one of your co-applicants submitted the CV template. It was somebody in Belgium, the CV template, and it is over the page limit. And I hadn't picked up on that. I hadn't checked it. I thought they were doing the common CV, but now people outside of Canada are allowed to use the CV template, and we just had missed that. So I was able to fix that, also because there was enough time to allow for that. So building a little bit extra time. It's really bonus also in basic science, and we sometimes forget about that, to have stakeholder and patient involvement. Direct translation is bonus. I didn't put it here, but I don't think you can get away, and that's in addition to the basic science pilot data. I think it's hard to get away at CHR right now to propose animal studies without having some preliminary data to allow for power calculations and sample size calculations, because there is more and more to choose from, and the ones that get funded provide that information. So checklist for your first big grant. Find someone, preferably 2 people who love you and are very critical. Start early. So I started off by saying 4 to 6 months, but nobody's going to fault you for starting 4 to 6 months earlier even. Read the call and review criteria first and highlight themes that you want to highlight in your grant. The other thing to keep in mind, if you find somebody to review your grant, these people are going to be busy if they've been successful. You can ask them to review your grant one day before the deadline, but then first, there's not going to be a lot of time for them to review it. Second, there's not going to be a lot of time for you to actually work with their recommendations. So they'll do it maybe if they really love you, but you're not going to benefit from their feedback. So the earlier you have your whole grant application in a good state to work with these people, the better the outcome is going to be. Develop your theoretical model, pilot data, and or systematic review. Get the grant reviewed 3 to 5 times before you submit, and allow very critical feedback, and don't take it personal. You rather answer these questions before it goes in for review than afterwards. And then another thing that can be helpful is if you have a family member or a layperson that can read a little bit more complex newspaper article, and you have them read your grant and they get the message, it means it's pretty well written and it's pretty clear. And I think that helps also to get your message across really clearly. So you don't need somebody to tell you this is a very nice grant. You don't need somebody to tell you this should be funded by CAHR. You don't need somebody to tell you, well done, I do not have much to add. Look for that person that's going to work with you. Look for that person that's going to read it very critical, come up with all the difficult questions that can be asked to clarify, and then work on it to get a better version of your grant before you submit it. I asked people like that, and they came back to me and said, well, you know, like, this is boring stuff. Why are you telling me this? Why do I need to know this? It's unclear to me. You're talking about this, but then it doesn't come back in the rest of the grant. So now I'm confused. And then they say, like, I wouldn't fund this if I was the reviewer. And then I don't like your hypothesis. Work on it more, like fine tune it, make it better, make it more clear. Think about it again. This is the kind of feedback that you need, because this is going to help you to get a better and better version of your grant. As I said, again, don't take it personally. You want your grant to be taken apart before you submit it. Start early so you have enough time to fix it. So this is how I got my first grant back, with all these revisions. This was from John McGavick. And he said, well, I worked on it. It's pretty, a lot of it has changed. Why don't we go for a coffee so we can go through it? And we did. He walked me through it, and I started plugging away at it, and it got funded afterwards. So I think it is definitely doable. It is possible to get your grants funded, but it's a process and you have to learn it. So this is taken from this paper in the Annals of Internal Medicine with a suggested timeline. Final tips: review successful grants, form a good team, involve a statistician if this is not your thing, to make sure that you have sound statistical methods so that you don't get a statistical reviewer who's going to challenge your proposed statistical methods. And especially in basic science, when I did my PhD, we kind of explained sample size calculation and the number of samples that we took. It was 3 experiments and 3 samples. So that's how we got away with our cell experiments and animal experiments. But that's not enough anymore. Good journals are going to ask for justification of your sample size, justification of your number of experiments, and you need to be prepared for that. Your summary page needs to be perfect. So some people start with that, some people wait for a little bit later, but that is probably the one page that almost everybody on the committee is going to read, because while the reviewers are going to be discussing your grant, a lot of people who have not reviewed your grant will use the summary page to get a feel for what is going to be discussed. So make sure that that is really strong. And as we've discussed, look up your review panel. So these are some resources. There's lots out there. I found the CHR guide is really good, and that paper in Nature is also really good, but there's multiple resources. So that was my presentation. We'll go back to, I'll stop sharing.